Hello there. It is it's morning here. It's 12:37 in military or in civilian time, 12:37 a.m. So 37 minutes after midnight. In military time, it's 00:37, which means it's September 2nd. And yesterday, the 1st, Labor Day, was the first day of National Bourbon Heritage Month. Now, according to Wikipedia, Congress only passed that resolution once in 2007, so almost 20 years ago. And to make it official, they'd need to either keep passing it or make it a permanent thing, and apparently they have not done either. Nevertheless, Congress did at one time declare that September is National Bourbon Heritage Month, and as far as I'm concerned, it is. Now, I'm recording this, as I say, on the 2nd. Exactly when I will upload it, I don't know. I will make it a point to upload it in September at some point. One day in September. Preferably not the last day. I will diligently seek not to wait that long. Sippin' and talkin'. That's what we're doing here. And our bottle is the Rebel Distillers Collection. This is a Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. That means they made it in Kentucky. It's at least 2 years old. It has no artificial colors or flavors. It follows all the other rules of bourbon. Does it have an age statement? I do not see an age statement here on the bottle. Okay, it has barrel number, barrel filled, but not an age statement. That means that being a straight whiskey, it is at least 4 years old. It has to be 2 years minimum to be straight whiskey, and between 2 and 4 years you have to put an age statement on. So this is at least 4 years old. It is 113 proof. It has a nice pretty label, as I already showed you. This is from Lux Row Distillers. At one point they were using MGP juice, the big distiller down in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, up in Lawrenceburg. What am I saying? I mean, I'm not no Yankee. Thanks goodness for that. But MGP makes a whole slew of whiskey, and most of it they sell to other people who either have not yet got their whiskey aged sufficiently to sell, or simply have a brand and are perfectly happy to either have somebody contract distill it or buy pre-existing barrels. But Lux Row now has its own distillery. This is distilled and aged in Kentucky for Lux Row Distillers. So this does come from Kentucky, which it has to be a straight or a Kentucky straight bourbon. That sounds like it did not yet come from their distillery. They might have been getting it from Bardstown Bourbon Company or who knows who. I didn't look into any of that. Rebel is a wheated bourbon. That means, and I'll shut up while I pour, that means that the majority grain, at least 51%, is corn. Excuse me, corn. By law, that's the case, and usually it's more. I don't know if there's anybody making a barely legal bourbon. They might make a barely legal rye, a barely legal corn whiskey, a barely legal wheat whiskey, but I don't know of anybody making a barely legal bourbon whiskey. But it's got at least 51% corn, and then the other two grains are wheat and barley. The traditional bourbon recipe is corn, rye, and barley. And so a wheated bourbon, there are more of them apparently than there used to be. You have to remember, or maybe you're just brand new to the channel and don't know, I've only been drinking whiskey for 4 years now. It was the 20th of September 2021 that I bought my first bottle of whiskey. First ever. That smells nice and sweet, but not cloyingly sweet. Now, it wasn't the first whiskey I'd ever drank. Back in the late 70s, very early 80s, I drank whiskey and Coke and such like, and I thought all whiskey tasted like turpentine unless you mixed it with Coke. Yeah, it's a honey sweetness, but as I say, not cloying. There's some floral characteristic in there. I can't identify any sort of specific flower. And there's a note that whenever I get it, I don't know any other way to describe it than to say it's a warm note. It's not that there's physical heat on my nose or in my nostrils, but whatever this is, it smells warm. That's all I know. I had an idea. Let me test it. It might, maybe, possibly, perhaps, be reminiscent of hot bread coming out of the oven. My mama made her bread from scratch. Only thing she bought flour. She didn't grind her own wheat. She bought yeast. She called it yeast instead of keeping her own, but from the ingredients, she made bread from scratch, and it was delicious. That might be bread in there. I won't swear to it. And I forgot where I was. So Bourbon Heritage Month, that's where I intend to be, even if it's not where I was. There's already a National Bourbon Day in June, I believe it is. But this is National Bourbon Heritage Month. And we need to go back just a tad to get some background on that. In 1964, Congress declared that bourbon is a distinctive American spirit. Now that was true all along, but it didn't have official recognition until 64. That's the year I turned 4 and the humongous Alaska earthquake happened. And I can't swear to it. I think maybe I heard some of the news coverage of that earthquake. But remembering back 61 years, I couldn't swear to it if you put a gun to my head. With wheat in there, I'm not getting all the spiciness that you get from a traditional bourbon. And I still sometimes will get from a wheated bourbon, because wheat has different characteristics from rye. But in 64, Congress recognized bourbon as the Native American spirit and decreed that you can only make bourbon within the United States. Previously, you could go to Canada and make whiskey and call it bourbon. You could go to Mexico. You could go to Korea. You could go to France and make bourbon. From the day that that passed and went into effect, I should say, you cannot make bourbon in Canada, Mexico, Korea, France, any country except the United States. And so you could have a distillery half in the States, half in Canada, the border running right down the middle, 2 rows of stills, 2 rows of fermenters, exact same grain, same trucks delivering the same grain from the same suppliers, the same equipment grinding it, the same yeast when you mash it in, the same stills from the same company, the exact same process, exact same barrels from the exact same cooperage, warehouse, one on this side, one on that side. In Canada, it's not bourbon. In the United States, it is. And although I like the designation as America's native spirit, it seems strange to me that a matter of a line on the floor determines whether it's bourbon or not bourbon. International boundaries are necessary, they're useful, sometimes they lead to weirdness. Got a really nice mouthfeel. What proof was it? 113. So there's alcohol in there, and it's somewhat oily. Nice, smooth, creamy mouthfeel. And although on the first sip I don't go for the flavor, I go for the mouthfeel, I got brown sugar all over the place. I got honey. I got just a hint of cinnamon, and that would have come from the barrel. Now, in '64, Congress declared that bourbon is the native spirit of the United States. But bourbon is much older than that. Now, nobody knows who first made whiskey we would recognize as bourbon. Some people will tell you it was Elijah Craig. Well, he made whiskey in Kentucky. Was it bourbon? If so, was he the first person to make that particular variety of whiskey? Probably not. Probably several people at the same general time in the same general area were making the same general kind of whiskey that eventually came to have the name bourbon. Now, the name originally comes probably from Bourbon County, Kentucky, which once was much larger than it is. At one time, for that matter, Kentucky was a county of Virginia. At the time of the Treaty of Paris, which recognized the independence of the 13 original states, most of those states claimed land reaching all the way to the Mississippi. And that later wound up dividing up and becoming multiple states. Kentucky was once a county of Virginia. And when Kentucky became a state, 17 something or another, I don't remember exactly what, Bourbon County was much bigger than it is. And it shrank as other counties have formed from its territory. Probably the name bourbon whiskey came from Bourbon County. It might not be the case. It might have come from Bourbon Street down in New Orleans. And both took their name from the Bourbon dynasty of French kings. Although the Bourbons were also in Spain. Right now, I don't know his full set of names, but the King of Spain is Felipe de Bourbon, Philip of the House of Bourbon. So, like it or not, and I really don't, I have as much use for the French as Al Bundy. Pretty much zip. You know, you see an ad in the newspaper, for sale, French rifle, never fired, dropped once. The Foreign Legion I respect. The rest of France, not much reason to respect them, in my judgment. They might look at me and reciprocate. But bourbon goes back more or less to the early days of the United States. And whiskey making in the Appalachians goes back to the beginnings of the United States. And I don't know the details. You can look this all up and get much more detailed and accurate information. The basics I'm going to give you, though, are correct. Shortly after the Revolutionary War, Congress, realizing that the United States faced crushing debt, passed an excise tax, and George Washington signed the bill into law. So you had an excise tax on whiskey. And in western Pennsylvania, the farmers there had been making whiskey out of their excess rye for generations. And suddenly, if they didn't pay the tax and if they didn't get a permit from the government to operate the still, they were in violation of the law. Suddenly the law had made them criminals for doing what they had done all their lives. Well, they rose up and burned a tax collector's house and run him out of town. I don't believe they tarred and feathered him. I think they just run him out of town. And George Washington raised, I think it was like 5,000 troops, which at the time was not an inconsiderable number. And he personally, in his capacity as commander-in-chief under the Constitution, led that army into Pennsylvania. And the farmers, realizing they could not fight against George Washington and his troops, backed off. The rebellion fizzled out, but a lot of those western Pennsylvania farmers moved south into the southern Appalachians, what's now Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Georgia. And they went right on making whiskey without paying the excise tax. And back in those days, tax collectors couldn't get in there, and if they did, they was liable to never come back out. It's like the song Rocky Top by Felice and Boudleaux Bryant. There's a line that says, "Once two strangers climbed up Rocky Top looking for a moonshine still. Strangers ain't come down from Rocky Top, reckon they never will." Revenuers have always had a bad name in that part of the world. But these transplanted farmers found that corn grew down there better than rye did. And rye, of course, grew well up in Pennsylvania. The climate was suited for rye up there, for corn down south. And so they commenced to making corn liquor. And they founded a tradition that goes on to this day. If you've ever seen moonshiners, you've just seen a tip of the top of the iceberg. You know, Tim Smith, Mark Ramsey and Digger Maines, Kenny and Henry Law, and Kenny has died, Mark Rogers. You know, these are genuine liquor makers. They really do go out in the woods and make liquor illegally, and if they get caught, to go to jail. In fact, the laws were in prison. Tim Smith's daddy went to prison. Junior Johnson, who was one of the big names in stock car racing for a long time, he never got caught bootlegging, but one time he got caught guarding his daddy's still, and so he did prison time. You know, and it's going on there still, and there's no way to stomp it out. You know, them moonshiners are like the Hank Williams Jr. song, "Can't stomp us out, can't make us run." So that's bourbon's heritage. It really sprang from the Whiskey Rebellion when those farmers moved south into Appalachia, began making whiskey with corn. Legal distillers moved in a little slower from the east into the mountains, learned how to make whiskey from corn, and barrel aging was not brand new. The French had been doing it with the cognac for a while. Winemakers had been doing it for a long time. But that whiskey, they made it, they threw it in a barrel, they shipped it off to sell. And it aged almost by accident on the flatboats and keelboats going down the Mississippi to New Orleans and other points along the river. And people began asking for that red liquor. And I don't know how well it'll show up. It looks more copper colored there. Let me see how it looks in the bottle on the screen. That's more reddish. And you get a bottle of bourbon and set it out in the sun, and you get in the right place, the light shining through it is red. They started asking for the red liquor because it tasted better than the stuff that was just still white. And somewhere along the line, whether they were saying whiskey from Bourbon Street or whiskey from Bourbon County, they started asking for bourbon whiskey, and that's how it come about. Congress passed their law in '64, making this stuff America's native spirit. And in 2007, they declared National Bourbon Heritage Month, and here we are. And with all that talking about bourbon and the history and Bourbon Heritage Month, I haven't talked much about the whiskey itself at all. But on that sip, very buttery. It was like honey butter with, of course, some cinnamon, some brown sugar. And let me take a sip and tell you about the finish. Oaky. Definitely an oaky finish. Some spice blooming backwards from the front of my tongue, stopping about a quarter of the way back. There's a honey sweetness underneath all that. Only thing that's really lingering is the oak, and it's fading. Well, now in the middle of my tongue it's turning into dark chocolate. And oak frequently gives me a chocolate note. But on that last sip, underneath everything else, I got the taste of a Werther's caramel, the hard caramel, not the chewy, the hard caramel. And caramel and cinnamon, vanilla, these are standard bourbon notes that come from the charred oak barrels. But this is at not quite 25 minutes, which is longer than I had intended. It always is. So I moved the bottle to the side so I can reach the button. It looks like I'm pointing to the side. There is where the button is, but the lens is over here, so Anyway, Southern whiskey, Southern history, Southern boy. Yeehaw.